For years, scientists searched this lake for a fish they believed was gone. They searched the shallow water. They searched the reeds. They searched the deeper parts of the lake where the fish had once been common. Nothing. The species had disappeared so completely that eventually, people stopped asking where it had gone. They began asking when it had gone extinct. But there was another fish in the lake, an introduced species that had multiplied until it dominated the water. And when scientists finally began removing that invasive fish, something strange happened. At first, there was no sign of the missing species. Then one appeared. Then another. And suddenly, scientists were facing a possibility that seemed almost impossible. The fish they thought had disappeared might never have disappeared at all. It may simply have been hiding in an ecosystem that had become almost impossible for it to live in. To understand how that could happen, you have to go back to the beginning. Before the invasive fish arrived, the lake was a completely different place. Native fish occupied different depths. Some fed along the bottom. Others lived among aquatic plants. Some spawned in shallow water. Others depended on clean gravel, submerged vegetation, or quiet sections of shoreline where their eggs could survive. The lake was not empty. It was an interconnected system. Every species occupied a particular place inside it, and for thousands of years, those relationships had developed together. Then humans introduced a fish that did not belong there. At first, almost nothing appeared to change. A few fish became a few dozen, then hundreds, then thousands. And because the new fish had arrived without the predators, competitors, diseases, or environmental pressures that had controlled its population in its original range, it began to spread through the lake. That was the first mistake people made. They looked at the invasive fish as a new species occupying new water. They did not yet understand that it was changing the water itself. Invasive fish can affect an ecosystem in several ways. Some eat native fish. Some consume eggs and young. Some compete for the same food. Some disturb sediments while feeding on the lake bottom. Others destroy aquatic vegetation or change the places where native species can reproduce. And sometimes the damage is indirect. The invasive fish does not need to kill a native species one by one. It only needs to make survival slightly harder every year. A few fewer eggs survive. A few fewer juveniles reach adulthood. A few fewer adults reproduce. And after enough generations, a population that once filled a lake can become almost invisible. That appears to have happened here. The native fish began disappearing from surveys. Researchers kept looking. They found fewer individuals. Then, almost none. Eventually, there were no confirmed observations. The species had vanished from the places where scientists expected to find it. And that created an enormous problem. Because when a species disappears from a lake, there are two very different possibilities. The first is extinction. The second is survival somewhere nobody is looking. Those two possibilities can look exactly the same. For a tiny population, the difference may be only a few surviving adults hidden among thousands of invasive fish. And that is where the mystery begins. Scientists knew the native fish had once lived in the lake. They knew what it looked like. They knew where it had been found historically, but they could not find it anymore. So the obvious conclusion was that the population had collapsed. The invasive fish became one of the leading suspects. But removing an invasive fish from a lake is not as simple as taking it out with a fishing net. A lake can contain thousands, sometimes millions of fish. They occupy different depths. They hide in vegetation. They move into tributaries. They reproduce faster than people can remove them. And every fish that remains can potentially produce another generation. So scientists had to approach the problem differently. Instead of asking, how do we catch every invasive fish? They asked, how do we reduce the invasive population enough for the native ecosystem to recover? That distinction matters. Eradication and ecological recovery are not always the same thing. Sometimes you don't need to remove every individual. You need to remove enough of them to break the pressure they are putting on the ecosystem. The work can involve nets, traps, electrofishing, targeted removal, barriers, habitat restoration, or combinations of several techniques. And then comes the hardest part: waiting. Because ecosystems do not respond like machines. You cannot remove a fish on Monday and expect an entirely different lake on Tuesday. The invasive fish may disappear faster than its effects do. The vegetation may need time to recover. The food web may need time to rebuild. Native fish may need an entire breeding season before scientists can see whether reproduction has improved. And if the missing species is still there, it may be present in numbers so small that finding it is like searching for a handful of needles across an entire landscape of water. So the scientists kept monitoring. They counted fish, they sampled water, they examined habitats. They searched the places where the native species had historically been found. For a while, the lake appeared unchanged. And then came the first clue. It was not a huge school of fish. It was not a dramatic return. It was something much smaller. Evidence that one of the biological conditions required by the native species had begun to return. Perhaps the aquatic vegetation was recovering. Perhaps the water had become clearer. Perhaps the food organisms the native fish depended upon had increased. Perhaps spawning habitat had become usable again. Whatever the first signal was, it suggested something important. The lake was becoming suitable for the native species again. But suitable habitat does not prove that the species is still alive. Scientists needed evidence, and eventually they found it. A fish appeared that should not have been there. The first reaction was caution. A single observation is not enough. It could be a mistake, it could be another species, it could be an individual that had arrived from somewhere else. So scientists checked. They compared its physical characteristics. They examined the location. They looked at genetic or other biological evidence where available, and slowly the possibility became harder to ignore. The missing species was still there, not abundant, not thriving, but alive. The animal that had seemed to vanish had survived, and that changed the entire story, because now the question was no longer, how did this species return? It was, how did it survive all those years? The answer lies in one of the most important ideas in ecology. A population can disappear from sight long before it disappears completely. A species does not need thousands of individuals to survive. Sometimes a tiny remnant population can persist in a place that is barely suitable. It may occupy a small patch of habitat. It may reproduce only occasionally. It may avoid the places where scientists normally search. It may survive in deeper water, among dense vegetation, inside tributaries, or in another ecological refuge. And if the pressure preventing its recovery is finally removed, that tiny population can become the seed of a much larger recovery. This is why invasive species can be so dangerous. Their impact is not always an obvious mass killing. Sometimes they change the balance of an ecosystem just enough to prevent a vulnerable species from completing its life cycle. Imagine a native fish laying hundreds of eggs. If almost all of those eggs are eaten by an invasive predator, the adults might remain alive for years. To someone looking at the lake, the species may appear to be disappearing, but the real collapse is happening one generation at a time. The adults die. Very few young replace them. Then fewer young survive. Eventually, the fish becomes almost impossible to find. And if the invasive pressure continues, eventually even the last survivors may disappear. But remove that pressure early enough, and something remarkable can happen. The surviving fish finally gets a chance to reproduce. Its young survive. Those young become adults. The population begins producing more fish than it loses, and recovery becomes possible. This is sometimes called an extinction debt. A species can be destined for local disappearance because of conditions that already exist, even though some individuals remain alive. The opposite can also happen. A species can appear to be gone while a tiny population remains hidden. And that is why the return of a missing species can tell scientists something far more important than simply where the fish was hiding. It can reveal what the ecosystem was missing. The invasive fish may have been only one part of the problem. Habitat loss may have contributed. Changes in water levels may have mattered. Pollution may have played a role. Predators may have changed. Climate may have shifted. And human activity may have altered the shoreline. Removing one invasive species does not automatically restore an ecosystem, but it can remove one of the barriers preventing recovery. That distinction is critical, because there is a dangerous temptation in stories like this to imagine nature as a machine. Remove the bad species, wait, everything returns. Real ecosystems are rarely that simple. Sometimes invasive species removal works. Sometimes it fails. Sometimes native species return. Sometimes they do not. And sometimes the recovery takes years. But when it does work, the result can reveal something extraordinary. Nature may have retained the ability to recover long after humans assumed that ability was gone. That is what makes the extinct fish so important. The most dramatic part of the story is not that scientists found a fish. It is that they discovered the difference between absence and extinction. For decades, the lake had been interpreted through what people could see. The invasive fish was everywhere. The native species was nowhere. So the obvious conclusion was that one had replaced the other. But ecosystems can hide their secrets. A species can survive in numbers too small to notice. A population can persist in a corner of habitat that no survey reaches, and an ecosystem can remain damaged without being permanently destroyed. Once the invasive pressure is reduced, those hidden survivors may suddenly become visible. The first fish is therefore only the beginning. If scientists later find juveniles, that is more important. If they find spawning adults, it is more important still. Because a population is not truly recovering until it can reproduce itself. A single surviving animal is a rediscovery. A breeding population is a recovery. And a growing population is evidence that the ecosystem itself may be changing. That is the moment when a lake stops being a place where scientists are simply trying to save one species. It becomes a living experiment in ecological resilience. The invasive fish had changed the balance. The scientists changed one part of that balance back. And the native species responded. Not because humans created a new species, not because someone magically brought the past back, but because the biological machinery for recovery had never completely disappeared. The lake still contained pieces of its old ecosystem. The species still carried the genetic information needed to reproduce. The habitat still had the potential to support it. The only question was whether those pieces could reconnect. And sometimes that is what conservation really means. Not building an ecosystem from nothing. Not planting every tree. Not breeding every animal in captivity. Sometimes it means removing the thing that is preventing nature from using what it already has. That is the deeper lesson of invasive species management. The most important discovery may not be the invasive fish itself. It may be what becomes visible after the fish is gone. A plant begins growing. An insect returns. A native fish lays eggs. A bird appears along the shoreline. And suddenly, a place that seemed biologically empty begins behaving like a living ecosystem again. The lake had not necessarily forgotten how to recover. Scientists simply had to remove one of the pressures keeping that recovery hidden. And that is why the return of a supposedly extinct species is so powerful. Because extinction is usually imagined as a door that closes permanently. Once a species is gone, it is gone. But local extinction is different. A population can disappear from one lake while surviving somewhere nearby. It can fall below the level at which humans can easily detect it. It can remain trapped in a tiny refuge for years. And if the conditions that caused its disappearance are reversed, the population may have one more chance. That does not mean every lost species can return. Some really are gone. Some habitats have been destroyed beyond recovery. Some populations disappear completely. And some invasive species cause damage that cannot easily be reversed. But where survivors remain, the possibility is different. The ecosystem may still contain its own recovery plan. All it needs is an opportunity. Today, the most important question is no longer whether the native fish can exist in the lake. Scientists have already learned that it can. The question is whether it can remain there, whether it can reproduce, whether its young can survive, whether the invasive fish can be kept under control, and whether the surrounding habitat can remain healthy enough for the recovery to continue. Because ecological restoration is not finished when the first fish comes back. That is when the real test begins. The first individual proves survival. The first generation proves reproduction. And many generations prove recovery. For years, people looked at the lake and saw an invasive fish. Scientists looked at it and eventually began seeing something else. A native species that had almost disappeared. A food web that had been disrupted. A habitat waiting to recover. And perhaps most importantly, a population that had been hiding in plain sight. The fish that everyone thought was gone had not necessarily needed to be brought back. The lake needed to become a place where it could survive again. And once the pressure was removed, the lake began telling a very different story. Not a story about an extinct species returning from the dead, but a story about how close to extinction a species can come and still find a way to survive.